My name is Merete Bilde. I work for the European External Action Service, EEAS in short, which is the foreign policy entity of the European Union. The EEAS is an entity where we have both Commission officials together with member state diplomats working hand in hand to try to define the collective response to various situations, crises, opportunities outside Europe. It's focused towards the external action of the European Union. But in today's world, it's very difficult to keep these very strict separations up. What happens outside in our borders affects very much what happens inside. We see our foreign policy having a direct impact on our communities. I'm what you call a policy advisor. I try to help define and challenge the line inside this house. And my area of responsibility is issues at the cross-section between religion and foreign policy, which is fairly new on the diplomatic scene, and it's still fairly touchy, a little bit controversial, but very necessary. We look at how religion impacts foreign policy, because whether we like it or not, religion plays a role. And secondly, we try to build capacity in-house by raising the awareness in different thematic areas. It can be religion and religious freedom. It can be religion and conflict, the role between religion and development, etc., etc. And then finally, I am being pulled in more and more to issues which has to do with prevention of radicalization, and thus focusing more and more on issues related to security. We have spent a lot of time within the European institutions over the last 10 years, together with experts and practitioners in this field, to establish the drivers of radicalization. And we have established a fair amount of knowledge. And I would say that, ironically, we may not know that much about what drives radicalization. But one of the things we do know is that religiosity, strangely enough, doesn't. And when I say strangely enough, it's because very often in the wake of an attack, the public reflex is to go back to religion, is to go back to Islam, is go back and say, look, that proves Islam is inherently violent. Now that is not something that our studies can corroborate, and I think we would do wise to make sure that in our responses to these kind of attacks that we right-size religion, that we make sure that we don't make Islam and thereby a whole religious group responsible for something which they have very little stake in fact, as little as you and me. From where I sit, the main challenges to security inside Europe has to do with how we define our common political project and the sense of one Europe for all Europeans. It has to do with fighting against alienation as much as radicalization. I think also that in our foreign policy that we have a tendency to maybe look a little bit too much through the spectrum of security in terms of how we try to deal with what is increasingly a very, very complex world. We are a governmental organization, and governments tend to speak to governments. But to arrive at inclusive societies, whether it's in Europe or abroad, we need to get people into the center of the equation. Right now, especially in the Muslim majority world, there is a lot of sectarian strife, geopolitical rivalry, which has as collateral a lot of innocent peoples losing their livelihood and lives. It's very difficult to legislate tolerance and respect. It's not something you can do through legislation. It's something that has to come through the culture, through the education, etc. And that's where we are increasingly turning to the role of community leaders, religious leaders, media, to try to make sure that that kind of voice gets out there. There are some people out there who are hell-bent on creating havoc. And it comes with a degree of surveillance and smart intelligence and police work that you can prevent these attacks. I think when you live in an open society, you expect there to be a degree of accountability and a degree of control when, for various reasons, you submit your citizens to that kind of surveillance. At the same time, I think also we need not to engage in any kind of misunderstood tolerance, if I could say that. Societal security for me means inclusive societies, whether in Europe or abroad. It means societies where we each have our place, where there's responsibility bestowed on each of us. The more people feel they belong, which is very often at the local level rather than the national, let alone the international level, the more they will defend, stand up, and be part of. And I think you can project that, that finding or that reasoning to the situation in many of the countries that surround us, where right now we see a lot of polarization, we see a lot of exclusive governments, we see a lot of repression. Now, you want to create real stability, stability which is not enforced by heavy repression, heavy police force, etc. You need to make sure that you have an inclusive political project where everybody has their place at the table and where it's not the winner takes it all and the rest can be defined as terrorist. It's one where we all have our role, our part of the accountability that needs to be for a society to work.